Alzheimer's is typically considered a disease of aging, and it's also one of the leading causes of death in the United States, with Louisiana ranking 4th with the highest number of fatalities. Here today to talk to me about this disease is Dr. Robert L. Newton Jr. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So it's the end of Alzheimer's Awareness Month. Can you tell me a little bit about the nature of this disease?
So Alzheimer's disease is a disease of the brain. So essentially what happens is that there are dysfunction that's going on within the brain that causes a range of symptoms for people, memory problems and problems of processing information and learning. And so that's really what the nature of Alzheimer's disease is. It's a very insidious disease. Currently there's no cure, and it's progressive. So it usually, it always progresses and worsens over time.
Always?
Always.
So there's no way around it?
No, as of right now, there is no cure for Alzheimer's disease.
Is there any type of prevention method, anything you can do to maybe slow the process?
So we're investigating many different ways to try to prevent and slow the progression of Alzheimer's disease. One of the major factors that people are investigating right now are lifestyle interventions. And what I mean by lifestyle interventions are interventions in which we try to change people's behavior in order to reduce the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. So increasing physical activity, changing your diet, getting more sleep, increasing your social interaction. So, and using your brain in new and creative ways. And so there's a lot of trials right now, large trials across the world that are going on to try to see if any of these kinds of lifestyle behavior change interventions will result in decreased risk of developing Alzheimer's disease or cognitive decline. And those, again, are going on around the world. There's also research in drugs and pharmaceuticals in order to try to reduce the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. And so one of the major ones that was released in 2021 was aducanumab. And that drug showed that there's a decrease in plaques that form in the brain for Alzheimer's disease, but it didn't really show that there were any changes in symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. And so it was kind of controversial. And there are more drugs that are being developed every day to try to prevent this condition.
So you mentioned diet and lifestyle changes. How can diet and anything that you're doing in your daily life affect your brain?
So the way that lifestyle behavior typically works is that when you're doing physical activity or when you are increasing or improving your diet, it makes changes in the brain. So there are neurotrophic factors in the brain, things that are healthy for the brain, that physical activity increases, that diet can affect. And those things, improving the health of the brain, may potentially slow Alzheimer's, the development of Alzheimer's disease, or actually prevent it. And that's what we're investigating.
Okay, so I heard blood pressure, sugars, all of those things can be factors. Is that true? I mean, does that tie into what you just said?
Yes, there's a number of different factors that are risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. So we know that high blood pressure is a risk factor for developing Alzheimer's disease. We know that diabetes as well is a risk factor. And lifestyle behaviors. So people who exercise more have lower risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. That doesn't mean it prevents it, it just means that you have a lower risk. We also know that there's environmental factors that play a role as well. So lack of access to healthcare increases your risk for Alzheimer's disease. So there's a number of different factors that contribute, and we're trying to figure out which combination of these factors we can intervene on, which ones of these are modifiable to decrease the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease.
In America, is there a more vulnerable group?
Yes, there are different vulnerable groups. So age is one of the major risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. So as you age, you increase your risk. So people who are over 80 have a much greater risk of Alzheimer's disease compared to people who are less than 70, okay? There are other groups such as African Americans. African Americans actually have 2 times the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease compared to non-Hispanic white Americans. And Hispanic Americans actually have 1.5 times the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. So, and people with lower education also have greater risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. So there's different groups of people who are more at risk.
So from what you've said, it seems like there's no one thing that makes you more likely to get Alzheimer's. It's just a combination.
Yes, and it can be a different combination of factors for different people. So yes, there's not one thing that causes Alzheimer's disease. It's a combination of things that put people at risk for developing Alzheimer's disease.
Well, here at Pennington, I know that there is an institute that's dedicated to studying this type of disease. Are there any developments here specifically that we should be looking out for?
So there's a number of different studies that we have going on to try to see if by making alterations to people's lifestyle, does it reduce the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. So there's the rate studies that we're conducting. These are exercise interventions in which we're trying to increase people's exercise to see if it will reduce risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. And we also have an institute, as you mentioned, and those studies, they're looking at physical activity interventions. They're longitudinal studies that they're conducting to see which factors put people more at risk here in Louisiana. So there's a number of different studies that we have going on here investigating this disease.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Newton, for telling us all about this disease. And like I said, this is the last week of Alzheimer's Awareness Month. So hopefully you guys have been able to learn something from us.